want to continue on from that last video, talking about individual interpretation and how that becomes a little bit problematic. I mentioned, I think in my introduction, that after I left the Church of the Brethren, I joined a church that was just known as the Christian Church. It grew out of a movement started in the early 19th century in the United States that was called the Restoration movement that desired to restore New Testament Christianity. And it had several slogans that characterized it. And one of those slogans was, "Where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent." Okay. And that felt pretty good to me for a while, and it seemed to work for the early Restoration movement. The problem was that when you have individual interpretation, there's a question of what to do when the Bible is silent. Does that mean you don't say anything about it at all, or does it mean that you don't do it? And so the Restoration movement itself fractured over the course of its history, and there are now three distinct branches of the Restoration movement in the United States today. The progressive branch, the more liberal branch, mainstream branch, is known as the Disciples of Christ. The middle road, if you will, still pretty conservative, is known as the Christian churches. And then the really conservative body are known as the Churches of Christ, not to be confused with the United Church of Christ, the Congregationalist version. But the Churches of Christ, very conservative, are the people who do not use instruments. They're known as the non-instrumental Churches of Christ. They don't use instruments in their worship. And the reason they don't is because there's no reference in the New Testament to instruments being used in public worship. Now, you can sing songs and psalms, spiritual songs and hymns, but you just can't use instruments. So, and I just want to tell a story about this to show what happens. One of the things that can happen when you get this hard-headed, hard-nosed about this question of where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. My sister-in-law, my wife's sister, is or married a gentleman who was a member of the non-instrumental Churches of Christ. And when they were getting married, they wanted to ask my wife to read scripture in worship and at the wedding. And so my wife said yes, and it moved along a little ways. And then it came to the attention of the pastor that this was going to happen, and he said no. Because it says in the New Testament, we shall not allow a woman to speak in church. And so, in public worship. So that upset a lot of people, but it didn't change what happened. We all sat through the ceremony and just gritted our teeth with what was going on. My other sister-in-law and my wife and I. But then they had recorded music for the processional and the recessional. And it was Michael Bolton that they were playing in this church for this wedding. And we asked the question after how can you play CD music? Because there are, CDs are not mentioned in the New Testament. And their answer was, well, it wasn't a public service of worship. Well, it was a public service of worship for my wife not to be able to read, but it wasn't a public service of worship for them to be able to use recorded music. So I don't say this to be hypercritical of the Churches of Christ. They sing really well because they're not relying on instruments to cover their singing. So they do sing really well. But it highlights the individual nature, the sort of disembodied nature of interpretation of Scripture. And that's something that we in the Episcopal Church do not want to to further. We don't. We have always said that it should be read in the context of community, and that's how we do it. So as we move forward in our conversations over the course of this quarter, and certainly in this particular section on Holy Scripture, the question of interpretation is certainly key.